Daf Yomi, Tractate Chullin, page 38a, top of the page, with the words Goe behatila. Rei v'chi shkesha be'ozna, Hare ze pirkus, Amar lehu itzricha le'laba lazoze one, Shani omer, Okay, if the animal lows or excreted excrement or wiggled its ear during the slaughter, that is a convulsion, and the slaughterer renders eating the flesh of the animal permitted. Shmuel said to them, is it necessary, according to Abba, meaning Rav, for the animal to move its ears during the slaughter, which requires a considerable life force? As I say, any movements of the animal that are not matters that the death of the animal engenders are convulsions sufficient to render the slaughter valid. Ma'ninu divarim shamesois amarav anan dididi me parsha li mine Demar Shmuel Haisayada Kefufa Upeshatata Davar Shameso Ise Pishuta Uchipafata Divarim Shameso Ise. The Gemara asks, what are the matters that death of the animal engenders? Rav Anan said, this was explained to me from Master Shmuel himself. I wonder if Mar Shmuel is Shmuel. Okay, anyway, this was explained to me from Master Shmuel himself. If the animal's foreleg was bent and the animal straightened it, that is a matter that the death of the animal engenders. But its foreleg was straight and the animal bent it, that is among the matters that the death of the animal does not engender and is a convulsion sufficient to render the slaughter valid. My komash belon tanina behema daka shepashti yadavlo hech zira pesula shena ela haitzas nefesh ha hech zira kashero. The Gemara asks, what is Shmuel teaching us with that statement? We already learned in the Mishnah the slaughter of a small animal that during its slaughter extended its foreleg that was bent and did not restore it to the bent position is not valid, as extending the foreleg is nothing other than part of the natural course of removal of the animal's soul from its body and not a convulsion indicating life. But one may infer that if the animal does restore its foreleg to the bent position, that indicates life and the slaughter is valid. The Gemara answers, if the halacha is learned from the Mishnah alone, I would say that it is specifically in a case where the animal's foreleg had been bent and the animal now straightens it and then bends it, that the slaughter is valid. But if the foreleg had been straight and the animal bent it, the slaughter is not valid. Therefore, Shmuel teaches us that if its foreleg was straight and the animal bent it, that is a convulsion sufficient to render the slaughter valid. Meisvei Rabbi Yossi Omer, Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, Goa b'sha'as shchita, ein ze pirkus. Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Yossi Omer mishmo, afilu hatila rei, v'chishkisha bizanava, ein ze pirkus. Kasha goa agoe, kasha rei. The Gemara raises an objection from a Braita to Rav's statement cited earlier. Rabbi Yossi says that Rabbi Meir would say, if an animal lows during its slaughter, that is not a convulsion sufficient to render the slaughter valid. Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Yossi, says in the name of Rabbi Yossi, even if the animal excreted excrement or wagged its tail, that is not a convulsion sufficient to render the slaughter valid. The Gemara now clarifies Rabbi Yossi's statement in the Braita that if an animal lows, it is not a convulsion sufficient to render the slaughter valid is difficult, as it contradicts the statement of Rav that if an animal lows, it is a convulsion. And Rabbi Elazar's statement in the Braita that if an animal excreted excrement, it is not a convulsion sufficient to render the slaughter valid is difficult, as it contradicts the statement of Rav that if an animal excreted excrement, it is a convulsion. Go elokashia, ha diamekalo, re'yarei nami lokashia, kan be shotetis, kan be matrezis. The Gemara answers the apparent contradiction between the opinion that when an animal lows, it is a convulsion, and the opinion that when an animal lows, it is not a convulsion, it is not difficult. This opinion that it is a convulsion is referring to a case where the animal's voice is rich and powerful, a clear indication of life. That opinion that it is not a convulsion is referring to a case where the animal's voice is muted, which is not an indication of life. The apparent contradiction between the opinion that when an animal excreted excrement, it is a convulsion, and the opinion that when an animal excreted excrement, it is not a convulsion, is also not difficult. Here, the opinion that it is not a convulsion is referring to a case where the animal expels the excrement in a trickle. That is not an indication of life. There, the opinion that it is a convulsion is referring to a case where the animal expels the excrement with force. That is an indication of life. Amar Rav Chizda Pirkus she'amru b'sof shchita, mai b'sof shchita, v'emsa shchita le'apok yitchila shchita le'lo. The Gemara continues its definition of convulsion that indicates life. Rav Chizda said, I was taught that the convulsion that the sages said is an indication of life is a convulsion at the conclusion of the act of slaughter. Rav Chizda elaborates what is the meaning of at the conclusion of the act of slaughter. It means even in the midst of the slaughter. The sages said that it must be at the conclusion of the slaughter only to exclude convulsions at the beginning of the act of slaughter which are not an indication of life. Amar Rav Chizda minamin la Itzdan be'madaka shepashta yadav lo hechzira v'sula emas inema b'so shchita kol hachi techi b'teizal ela la b'yemtza shchita. Rav Chizda said, from where do I say that a convulsion in the midst of the act of slaughter is an indication of life? It is from the Mishnah, as we learned, the slaughter of a small animal that when being slaughtered extended its foreleg that was bent and did not restore it to the bent position is not valid, as extending the foreleg is only part of the natural course of removal of the animal's soul from his body and not a convulsion indicating life. Rav Chizda elaborates, when did the animal extend its foreleg but not restore it? If we say that it occurred at the conclusion of the slaughter, must the animal continue living for so extended a period that it restores its leg to its bent position after the slaughter is complete? Is the slaughter truly not valid otherwise? Rather, it is not that the Mishnah is referring to a case where the animal extends its foreleg in the middle of the slaughter. If so, then when it restores its leg as well, it is considered a convulsion that indicates life. Amar le Rabbe le'olam b'sof shechitas shchita she'ani omer kol she'no yiseb ken b'sof shchita b'yadua she'nishmatan nitula himena koidim lechein. Rava said to Rav Chizda, that is no proof. Actually, one could explain that the Mishnah is referring to a case where the animal extends its foreleg but did not restore it to the bent position, at the conclusion of the slaughter. As I say, with regard to any animal that does not do so at the conclusion of the slaughter, it is known that its soul was taken from it before that moment, and it was not alive. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Pirkus Shamru b'Techila Shchita. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said the convulsion that the sages said is an indication of life is a convulsion even at the beginning of the act of slaughter. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak ben Amin Eladis Nan Amar Rav Shimon Ashochet b'layla u'lemachar matzah katolim b'leim dam k'shera shezinko u'chemidas Rabbi Eliezer v'yamar Shmuel kos leibes shchita shaninu yamret b'shlom b'tchila shchita shapir Ela yamret b'sov shchita leichush dilma b'tchila shchita zinka. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak explained further and said, from where do I say that this is so? It is from the Mishnah, as we learned, that Rabbi Shimon says, in the case of one who slaughters at night, and the next day he awoke and found walls full of blood, the slaughter is valid, as it is clear that the blood spurted, and this is in accordance with the rule of Rabbi Eliezer. And Shmuel said, with regard to the walls mentioned in the statement of Rabbi Shimon, it is the walls of the place of the slaughter, meaning the walls of the neck, not the walls of the house, that we learned. Granted, if you say that a convulsion, even at the beginning of the act of slaughter, is an indication of life, this works out well. But if you say that a convulsion is an indication of life only at the conclusion of the act of slaughter, let us be concerned that perhaps the blood spurted onto the walls of the neck at the beginning of the act of slaughter, and there was no indication of life. The Gemara rejects that proof, but perhaps spurting is different, as it is superior as an indication of life, extending or bending a foreleg, and therefore, although extending or bending a foreleg is a sufficient indicator of life only at the conclusion of the act of slaughter, spurting is a sufficient indicator even at the beginning of the act of slaughter. Mi'adif yatanan Rabbi Eliezer Omer Daya imzinka kal mi de Rabbanan Gamliel midraban Gamliel mi'adif midrabanan. The Gemara asks, and is spurting superior? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer says it is sufficient if blood spurted from the neck, indicating that spurting of blood is a less substantive indication of life than those indications mentioned in the statement of Rabban Gamliel, who requires that the animal convulse with its foreleg and with its hind leg. The Gemara answers Rabbi Eliezer's requirement of spurting is less substantive than the requirements of Rabbi Gamliel as an indication of life, but superior to the requirements of the rabbis as an indication of life, where the rabbis require that the animal convulse either with its foreleg or with its hind leg. Amar Ravina Amali Sama bar Chilkai Akshiba Vode bar Abuveram Akshiba Vode bar Abuveram Yamrila Vode bar Abuveram Midramanan Miadifa Ditnan Chachamim Amrim Achitit bar Kes Obiad Oberegel. Ravina said, Sama bar Chilkai said to me that the father of Bar Abuveram, and some say that it was the brother of Bar Abuveram, raises a difficulty. And is blood spurting superior to the requirement of the rabbis as an indication of life? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah, the rabbis say it is permitted only in a case where it convulses with its foreleg or with its hind leg, or in a case where it wags its tail? Rabbanan Haikai Mileva Rabban Gamliel Kevin the Pirkasami Baile. Ravina elaborates to which statement of the Tanaim in the Mishnah do the rabbis stand and respond. If we say that they're responding to the statement of Rabban Gamliel, who requires the animal convulse with its foreleg and with its hind leg, the rabbis should have said, once the animal convulses with its foreleg or with its hind leg, or wagged its tail, indicating that this is sufficient. Rather, it is obvious that the rabbis are responding to the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is superior to that of the rabbis as an indication of life. What is the meaning of it is permitted only in a case where it convulses with its foreleg or with its hind leg, or it wags its tail? In that case, too, the rabbi should have said, once the animal convulses with its foreleg or with its hind leg, or it wags its tail, apparently the blood spurting is a less substantive indication of life, and the proof of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak remains valid. If spurting at the beginning of the act of slaughter is a sufficient indication of life to render the slaughter valid, then all the more so extending and bending a limb are also sufficient indications of life. Rava Amar Pirkus Shiamru B'Sof Shchitam Rava Menamin Le Titania. Alright, we'll stop here and we'll continue on the 38b, but just to finish the English here. Rava said the convulsion that the rabbis said is an indication of life is a convulsion at the conclusion of the act of slaughter. Rava said, from where do I say that in this case? It is as taught in a Braita with regard to the verse, when a bull or sheep or a goat is born, it shall be 7 days under its mother, and from the 8th day on and onward it may be accepted as for an offering to the Lord. Leviticus 22, verse 27. The phrase a bull. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll continue on to 38b, next video.